Welcome to the Drowsy Inquirer. This is a place for quiet curiosity, where ideas are allowed to unfold, without pressure, and without the expectation that they need to resolve into answers. You don't have to follow every thought closely, and you don't have to let them drift away either. They can simply move alongside you, at their own pace. Some people listen to think more clearly. Others listen as their thoughts slowly lose their edges. Both ways of listening belong here. If this is your first time, there's nothing you've missed. This is exactly where it begins. We're very used to things having a center. Rooms have centers. Cities do. Stories do. Even conversations tend to organize themselves around a central idea, a point everything else refers back to. Your own experience works the same way. Thoughts seem to come from somewhere. Attention gathers around a point you instinctively recognize as you. It feels stable. It feels familiar. It feels like a reference. Because of that, it's natural to assume the universe works the same way. That somewhere out there, there must be a middle. A place where things are more important, more fundamental, or more real than anywhere else. A point the rest of existence quietly revolves around. For most of human history, this assumption went unchallenged. Not because it was proven, but because it felt intuitive. We looked outward and imagined that the structure we experienced locally must also apply globally. But when we began observing the universe on its largest scales, that intuition started to weaken. It's worth remembering that the idea of a center was never just scientific. It was psychological. For a long time, placing something at the center made the world easier to understand. It gave structure to experience. It told us where to stand, and what mattered most. Early models of the universe reflected this instinct. They weren't careless. They were human. We organized the cosmos the same way we organized stories, maps, and belief systems. Around a middle. Around something familiar. Letting go of that habit didn't happen quickly. It happened gradually, as observation slowly replaced intuition. According to modern cosmology, space appears essentially the same. No matter where you observe from, there is no direction that looks privileged. No location that behaves differently, simply because of where it is. When astronomers look outward, they see galaxies moving away in every direction, not from a single point, not toward a distant edge, but uniformly, as if expansion itself has no preferred location. This conclusion isn't philosophical. It comes from measurement, from carefully tracking light, from observing how wavelengths stretch as they travel across vast distances of space. The farther away a galaxy is, the more its light is stretched, and the faster it appears to be receding. This relationship is known as Hubble's law, and it forms one of the foundations of modern cosmology. What matters here is not the equation itself, but what it quietly implies. If every point in space observes the same expansion, then no point is truly special. There is no marker in the universe that says, this is the center. No location where existence is more itself than anywhere else. That idea doesn't remove meaning, but it does change where we're used to looking for it. Once you sit with this idea for a moment, the absence of a center starts to feel less abstract and more practical. If space itself has no preferred location, then movement through it changes meaning. There is no fixed background, no reference point quietly anchoring everything else. Expansion doesn't happen from somewhere. It happens everywhere. This is why every observer, no matter where they are, sees roughly the same large-scale picture. Galaxies recede. Distances grow. Patterns repeat. Not because observation creates reality, but because the structure of space is consistent across locations. That consistency is what makes the idea unsettling. It removes hierarchy. It removes direction. It removes the comforting sense that there is a main place, and everything else is arranged around it. Our instincts resist that. They try to pull experience back toward familiarity, toward centers, toward anchors. We want to know where we stand, not just physically, but conceptually. We want a map that tells us where meaning is concentrated. But a universe without a center doesn't provide that kind of map. Instead, it offers something quieter. A structure where location is temporary, where importance is local, where context replaces hierarchy. In such a universe, being here doesn't mean being close to anything fundamental. It simply means being present, where conditions allow presence. That idea often feels impersonal at first, as if it removes significance, as if it flattens everything into sameness. But it doesn't. It redistributes significance. Instead of concentrating it, meaning isn't placed at a cosmic address. It emerges wherever complexity gathers, where patterns stabilize long enough to observe themselves. That's why centers still feel real in everyday life. Your body has one. Your attention has one. Your experience organizes itself locally, even if the universe does not. Local centers still matter. They just aren't universal. And that distinction is important, because once you recognize it, the question quietly changes. It stops being about where the center of everything is, and becomes about how centers form at all, how temporary structures appear, how awareness organizes itself, and how something as small as a point of view can exist inside something that has no middle. Once the idea of a center begins to loosen, another assumption tends to surface quietly. The assumption that time is shared. That there's a single present moment moving forward everywhere in the same way, for everyone, all at once. But on large scales, and at high precision, time behaves differently than our instincts would like. According to modern physics, time depends on motion and gravity. Clocks moving at different speeds do not tick at the same rate. Clocks positioned in different gravitational fields do not measure time identically. This is not metaphor. It is a measurable feature of reality, tested with real instruments, in real conditions. A clock on a fast-moving aircraft can tick slightly differently from an identical clock left on the ground. A clock on a satellite can experience time at a different pace than a receiver below it. The differences are small, but they accumulate. So much so that systems like GPS must account for them. Without continual corrections, navigation would drift. Positions would slide away from where they should be. The world would become quietly unreliable. That's a strange thing to sit with, because it means the flow of time is not a single river. It's more like many local streams, each shaped by where it is and how it moves. They're close enough to align at human scale, which is why most of us never notice. But they are not perfectly identical. If space has no universal center, time has no universal present. And once you accept that, even gently, the question shifts again. Because the moment you remove a universal now, you also remove the idea that reality is happening in one synchronized place. Instead, reality happens locally. Experience happens locally. Measurement happens locally. This brings us to the role of the observer. Not the observer as a mystical concept, and not the observer as the center of the universe, but the observer as a practical fact. Wherever observation happens, there is a reference. There is a point of view. There is a local timeline, a local here, a local now, even if the universe does not provide a global one. That's why your experience still feels centered, even in a universe that isn't. Your life has a center because perception organizes itself. Attention gathers. Memory clusters around what mattered. The nervous system prioritizes. The mind filters. A point of view is created, and once it exists, it becomes the place your world unfolds from. In other words, the universe may not have a center, but experience always does. This is where the word local becomes important. Local doesn't mean small or insignificant. Local means situated. It means defined by conditions. It means shaped by context rather than by cosmic hierarchy. Your body is local. Your thoughts are local. Your senses are local. Even your certainty is local, because it depends on what information you have and what patterns your mind has learned to trust. And that begins to sound similar to what we saw with the center of space. No preferred location. No cosmic middle. No single place from which everything is arranged. Instead, patterns. Relationships. Structures that persist for a while, and then change. In that kind of universe, centers still exist, but they are temporary. They form wherever conditions allow them to form. A hurricane has a center. A city has a center. A cell has organizing structures. A conversation has a topic. Your attention has a focal point. But these centers are not fixed anchors for all of reality. They are local solutions, local arrangements that hold together for a time. Even the center of you is, in a sense, local. It is not one physical point that everything revolves around. It's a coordination. A pattern of signals, sensations, memories, and predictions that your brain integrates into a coherent point of view. That point of view feels stable because stability is useful. It helps you navigate. It helps you decide what matters. It helps you remain yourself from one moment to the next. But stability is not the same as permanence. In fact, a lot of what feels permanent is simply slow. A mountain seems permanent because it changes slowly relative to a human lifespan. A star seems permanent because it outlasts generations. A galaxy seems permanent because its timescales are so large that motion becomes difficult to feel. Yet everything changes. And in a universe without a central anchor, change is not an exception. It's the baseline. Stars form and burn. They rearrange elements. They scatter material. Galaxies assemble, collide, and drift apart. New structures appear, persist briefly, and then dissolve into other structures. Nothing holds the center for long. The universe is generous with patterns, but it does not promise to keep any specific pattern forever. Seen this way, your existence is not diminished by the absence of a cosmic center. It's clarified. You are not placed near meaning. You are one of the places where meaning briefly appears. Meaning is not stamped onto the universe from a single point. It emerges where complexity gathers and becomes stable enough to notice itself. It emerges where information is processed, where memory forms, where attention selects, where a point of view is created. And this is why your experience can feel both small and profound at the same time. Small in scale, because the universe is vast. Profound in function, because experience is rare and precise. It is a local event that can contain an entire world. This also explains something else, something practical. Why at night, when the world quiets down, the sense of time can soften. Because your brain stops prioritizing deadlines and tasks. Because attention becomes less rigid. Because the nervous system changes its rhythm. And when the rhythm changes, the felt experience of time changes with it. Not because time is imaginary, but because your access to time is mediated through biology. Through sleep pressure. Through memory. Through attention. Through the way the brain measures change. So in a strange way, even that night feeling is a kind of local physics. A local experience of time shaped by the conditions of the observer. And when you think about it like that, the universe feels slightly different. Less like a stage with a center and a clock above it. More like an ongoing process, many local processes, coordinating, overlapping, and occasionally aligning well enough for a mind to notice and say, quietly, I am here. No cosmic center. No universal now. Just countless local moments, briefly organized, briefly aware. And that is enough to continue from. Once we begin to see space and time as local experiences, another quiet realization follows. The limits of what we can understand are not only imposed by the universe, but by the way we are built. Human perception did not evolve to measure cosmic distances, or to intuitively grasp geological time. It evolved to keep a body alive, within a narrow range of conditions. Your senses are tuned for survival, for movement, for contrast, for change that matters at the scale of a body. This means much of reality is filtered out before it ever reaches awareness. Not because it isn't real, but because it isn't immediately useful. You don't perceive infrared light. You don't hear most frequencies. You don't feel the motion of the planet beneath your feet, even though it's moving through space at remarkable speed. What you experience is a carefully reduced version of reality. A compressed interface. A summary optimized for action. This filtering doesn't make perception false. It makes it selective. And that selectivity shapes how the universe feels. Large timescales feel abstract, because nothing in your biology is designed to register them directly. Millions of years collapse into concepts. Distances collapse into numbers. What cannot be acted upon becomes difficult to feel. The brain handles this by building models, stories, explanations, frameworks that translate what cannot be sensed into something that can be thought about. But models are not the thing itself. They are tools. Useful. Approximate. and always incomplete. This is why scientific understanding often feels different from intuitive understanding. You can know something is true without feeling it. You can understand expansion, relativity, or deep time, and still feel as if the world around you is static and centered. That gap is not a failure of comprehension. It's a feature of cognition. Your brain prioritizes coherence. It wants the world to feel stable, continuous, and navigable. It smooths over inconsistencies. It fills gaps. It creates the experience of a continuous self, moving through a continuous world. Even consciousness itself is not a constant stream, but a sequence of moments, stitched together by memory and expectation. One of the things the brain does remarkably well is tolerate uncertainty, as long as it feels manageable. When uncertainty becomes overwhelming, the mind rushes to fill the gap. It looks for explanations, patterns, or familiar narratives. But when uncertainty is gentle, when it doesn't demand immediate action, the brain can simply hold it. This ability is deeply biological. It's tied to safety, to energy conservation, to the nervous system's sense that nothing urgent is required. In those moments, the brain stops forcing resolution. It allows multiple possibilities to coexist without conflict. This is why questions feel different when you're tired, or relaxed, or drifting toward sleep. The same unanswered thought that feels uncomfortable during the day can feel neutral, or even interesting at night. The difference isn't a question. It's the state of the system asking it. When attention softens, the need for certainty softens with it. The mind becomes less defensive, less insistent, less driven to close every loop. This doesn't reduce intelligence. It changes strategy. Instead of solving, the brain shifts toward observing. Instead of controlling, it shifts toward monitoring. And in that mode, complex ideas don't feel heavy. They feel spacious. They don't demand conclusions. They simply exist, waiting to be noticed, or left alone. What feels like a single, unbroken awareness is actually a coordination process. Signals arriving, patterns aligning, predictions updating. The sense of now is constructed, not invented, but assembled. And because it's assembled, it can change. Under certain conditions, time seems to slow. Attention narrows. Moments stretch. Under others, hours pass without notice. Memory thins. Awareness drifts. These changes don't mean time itself has altered in some fundamental way. They mean the system interpreting time has shifted its priorities. This is especially noticeable when external demands fall away. Late at night, in quiet environments, when the nervous system relaxes its grip on urgency, the brain stops asking, "What must happen next?" and starts asking less altogether. As prediction softens, the experience of time softens with it. This doesn't make perception less real. It makes it more revealing. It shows that what you experience is not a direct feed of reality, but a negotiation between the world and the limits of your biology. A universe without a center is difficult to feel. A universe without a universal present is difficult to imagine. But a universe filtered through perception, through attention, through a nervous system doing its best, is something you live inside of constantly. And understanding that, not intellectually, but gently, changes how questions feel. They become less urgent, less demanding, more open. Not because they've been answered, but because the need for final answers has loosened. And that looseness is often where the mind becomes most receptive to simply observing what is, without needing to organize it immediately. Which is where we'll continue next. As understanding deepens, another idea tends to surface. Not loudly, and not all at once, but gradually. The idea that not everything is meant to be fully known. For a long time, science was imagined as a process that would eventually explain everything. As if, given enough time, every question would resolve into a clear and final answer. But modern science paints a more subtle picture. At fundamental levels, uncertainty is not a temporary gap. It is built into how reality behaves. In quantum physics, outcomes are described as probabilities. Not because instruments are crude, but because the system itself does not settle into a single result until interaction occurs. This does not mean that reality is vague or unstable. It means that certainty has limits, and those limits are precise. In cosmology, we encounter similar boundaries. There are regions of the universe we cannot observe, not because they don't exist, but because light from them has not had enough time to reach us. There are events we can infer, but never directly witness. There are beginnings we can model, but not fully reconstruct. This isn't a failure of knowledge. It's a feature of scale. Every framework, no matter how powerful, operates within conditions. Outside those conditions, questions change form. Instead of asking, "What is the exact answer?" we begin asking, "What can be known from here?" That shift is subtle, but important. It replaces the idea of absolute perspective with situated understanding. Knowledge becomes contextual, accurate within bounds, reliable within limits. This idea can feel unfamiliar, because we often treat knowledge as something that accumulates until uncertainty disappears. But many scientific advances have moved in the opposite direction. They have not eliminated uncertainty. They have clarified where it begins. Instead of closing questions, they have refined them. Instead of collapsing possibilities, they have mapped their boundaries. This is especially clear in fields that deal with extremes. Very large scales, very small scales, very high energies, very early moments. At those edges, precision does not produce certainty. It produces structure, clear limits, defined ranges. And within those ranges, understanding becomes reliable. Outside them, it becomes speculation. This distinction matters because it allows knowledge to remain useful without pretending to be complete. It also changes the emotional tone of not knowing. Uncertainty stops feeling like a gap that must be filled immediately. It becomes part of the landscape, something expected, something navigable. This is why modern science often sounds careful rather than confident. Why conclusions are framed in terms of likelihood, confidence intervals, and margins of error. That caution is not weakness. It's discipline. It reflects an understanding that knowing where understanding ends is just as important as knowing what lies within it. And once those limits are acknowledged, something interesting happens. The pressure to resolve everything begins to ease. Not because curiosity disappears, but because it matures. Questions stop demanding closure. They become spaces to explore, rather than problems to eliminate. And this changes how the unknown feels. It becomes less threatening, less like a wall, and more like a horizon. Always present, always receding, always shaping what comes into view. Living with that horizon requires a different relationship with knowledge. Instead of asking for certainty, it asks for orientation. Not answers that close questions, but reference points that help you move without needing to see the entire landscape. This is something humans are surprisingly good at. Even outside of science, you navigate conversations without knowing where they will end. You move through days without knowing exactly what will happen. You make decisions with incomplete information, guided by patterns, experience, and intuition. Uncertainty does not stop action. It shapes how action happens. The same is true in science. The absence of final answers has not halted understanding. It has refined it. By acknowledging limits, models become more honest. Predictions become more careful. Explanations become more precise about where they apply and where they do not. This creates a kind of intellectual stability that does not depend on completeness. Instead of saying, "This is how things are," science often says, "This is how things behave under these conditions." That conditional understanding is less dramatic, but far more reliable. It allows knowledge to grow without pretending to be finished. And psychologically, this matters. When the mind accepts that not everything needs resolution, attention relaxes, cognitive load decreases. The nervous system no longer treats uncertainty as a threat that must be eliminated. This is why unresolved questions can feel heavy during the day, but lighter at night. It's not because answers appear. It's because urgency fades. The brain stops demanding closure and starts tolerating openness. In that space, uncertainty becomes livable. Not something to escape, but something to move within. A horizon instead of a wall. And once uncertainty feels like a horizon, the need to rush forward disappears. You can remain where you are, aware of what is known, aware of what is not, without feeling pulled in either direction. That balance, quiet and provisional, is where understanding often feels most stable. When the mind no longer feels obligated to resolve every question, attention changes quality. It becomes less directional, less task-oriented, more receptive. This is not disengagement. It's a different mode of awareness. One that notices patterns without immediately naming them. One that allows thoughts to arise without needing to follow each one. In this state, the universe does not feel like a puzzle. It feels like a process. Ongoing. Unfinished. Unbothered by whether it is understood. And that can be strangely comforting. Because it means nothing essential depends on your ability to keep track of everything. The universe does not require constant interpretation. It continues expanding, rearranging, forming structures, and letting them go. Stars burn without witnesses. Galaxies drift without attention. Time passes differently, in places no one will ever visit. And still, patterns appear. Again and again. Some of them become complex enough to notice themselves, to reflect, to wonder. That is not the center of the universe. But it is something the universe does. Right now. That process happens to include you. Not as a destination. Not as a conclusion. But as a moment. A temporary alignment of matter, memory, and awareness. You don't have to hold on to it. You don't have to understand it. You don't have to decide what it means. It's enough to notice that it's happening. If your thoughts begin to slow, let them. If they continue, that's fine too. There is no correct way to be present here. The questions can remain open. The answers can remain unfinished. Nothing needs to be resolved for this moment to be complete. As attention loosens, the sense of scale begins to shift again. Not outward this time, but inward. The universe doesn't disappear. It simply becomes less demanding. There is no need to track distances. No need to hold timelines in place. No need to remember how one idea led to another. The processes continue, whether they are observed or not. Stars continue forming and fading. Galaxies continue drifting, colliding, rearranging. Time continues passing at different rates, in different places. None of this requires commentary. And in that sense, nothing is missing. When attention softens, the universe is not paused by inattention. It is not threatened by rest. In fact, most of what happens in the universe happens without witnesses. Most stars will never be seen. Most events will never be named. Most moments will never be measured. And yet, patterns persist. Structure appears. Complexity gathers. Systems organize themselves briefly, and then dissolve. This does not make them pointless. It makes them temporary. And temporary things do not need to be justified by permanence. Your experience works in a similar way. Thoughts appear. They form patterns. They hold attention for a while, and then fade. You do not need to chase them. You do not need to resolve them. They move on their own. Awareness remains, even as content changes. And that awareness does not need to be directed to remain present. It can rest. When attention rests, time often feels different. Not slower or faster, but softer. Moments lose their edges. Boundaries blur. The need to mark progress falls away. This is not loss of focus. It is a shift in mode. A state where nothing is being prepared for, and nothing is being avoided. The body recognizes this state. The nervous system responds to it. Muscles release tension. Breathing settles into rhythm. Signals that once demanded response lose urgency. This is not something you have to do. It happens when conditions allow it. And if it doesn't happen, that's fine too. Nothing here requires a specific outcome. There is no destination. This moment needs to reach. The universe does not expect you to keep up with it. It does not expect comprehension. It does not expect attention. It simply continues. And for now, that continuation includes this quiet alignment of sound, thought, and awareness. Not as a conclusion. Not as a message. Just as a moment passing through. And when attention drifts, as it naturally does, the universe continues. Exactly as it always has. Open-ended. Uncentered. Quietly in motion.